George Michael's very first performance wasn't in a grand concert hall or on television. It was in a humble Cub Scout hut, where he nervously took the stage before a crowd of friends and family. No one in that room could have imagined that this boy from Radlett, with his thick glasses and a dream bigger than his small-town surroundings, would one day command sold-out arenas and change the face of pop music forever. But even as a child, George had something that set him apart, a quiet confidence and an unwavering belief that he was meant for something extraordinary. Born Georgios Kyriakos Panayotou in East Finchley, London, in 1963, George was the son of a Greek Cypriot restaurateur and an English dancer. Music wasn't just a passing interest for him, it was an obsession. As a teenager, he spent hours locked away in his room, perfecting melodies in his head, experimenting with sounds, and imagining the day he would break free from the ordinary. His family moved to Radlett when he was in his early teens, and it was there that fate introduced him to a boy who would change his life, Andrew Ridgeley. The two bonded instantly over their shared love for music, dreaming up plans to conquer the world long before they ever stepped into a studio. Before Wham became a household name, George and Andrew struggled to get noticed. They hustled their way into the industry, recording demos and handing them out to anyone who would listen. Rejections piled up, but they refused to give up. And then, in 1981, everything changed. They landed a record deal and unleashed their debut album, Fantastic, upon the world. It wasn't just a hit, it was a statement. Tracks like Young Guns, Go For It, and Bad Boys electrified the airwaves, capturing the energy of a new generation. And just when you thought they had reached the peak, they did something even bigger. With the release of Make It Big in 1984, Wham! Didn't just dominate the UK charts, they took over the world. Wake Me Up Before You Go Go wasn't just a song, it was a cultural explosion, a feel-good anthem that blasted from radios in every corner of the globe. The duo had achieved something unheard of at the time. They became the first Western pop act to perform in China, breaking through the country's strict cultural barriers and performing for tens of thousands of eager fans. It was a moment that cemented their status as global icons. Behind the infectious hooks and bright smiles, something was shifting. George Michael was about to make a move that would change everything. Just when the world thought they had George Michael figured out, he pulled off a move that no one saw coming. Wham! Was at the peak of its success. The duo was adored by millions. And yet, George was already plotting his next chapter, one that wouldn't just redefine his career, but change pop music forever. If you thought Wake Me Up Before You Go Go was the height of his artistry, Careless Whisper was about to prove you wrong. This wasn't just another Wham hit. It was something different, something deeper, more mature, and unmistakably George. The sultry saxophone intro, the melancholic lyrics, and the haunting melody sent shockwaves across the industry. It reached number 1 in nearly 25 countries and sold 6 million copies worldwide. But here's the kicker. George never even liked the song. Despite its massive success, he would later admit that he found it not particularly good, and yet it became one of the most iconic ballads of all time. While Careless Whisper hinted at what was to come, George wasn't quite ready to leave Wham, not just yet. He had one foot in the duo and another in the future, testing the waters with another solo single, A Different Corner, which once again topped the charts and showcased his emotional depth as a songwriter. By 1986, it was clear Wham had run its course. The duo bid their fans farewell with The Edge of Heaven and a sold-out concert at Wembley Stadium, closing the book on one chapter and opening the door to something even bigger. Then came Faith. His debut solo album wasn't just a success. It was a phenomenon. Faith wasn't just another pop album. It was a statement, a bold declaration that he wasn't just a former boy band star, he was an artist. The title track, with its infectious beat, signature guitar riff, and rebellious energy, became an instant classic, topping the charts in multiple countries and defining an era. But that's not all. The album was packed with hits: Father Figure, One More Try, and Monkey, each proving that George wasn't just chasing trends, he was setting them. Then there was I Want Your Sex. If you think the 80s were all about carefree fun, George was about to shake things up. The provocative track, released at the height of the AIDS epidemic, was a bold move that got him banned from several radio stations and censored by MTV. But George wasn't advocating for reckless abandon. He was challenging society's attitudes toward love and relationships, and he wasn't afraid to push boundaries. The controversy only fueled the album's success. Faith went on to sell over 25 million copies worldwide and won the Grammy for Album of the Year. But what happened next would turn his world upside down. Behind the fame, the flashing lights, and the chart-topping hits, he was carrying a secret, one that he feared could shatter everything he had built. While the world assumed they knew who he was, George was living a double life, trapped between the image the industry crafted for him and the truth he wasn't ready to share. But as much as he tried to keep his private life out of the spotlight, fate had other plans. For years, speculation swirled about his sexuality, fueled by his carefully curated public image. He had spent the 80s surrounded by supermodels in music videos, singing songs that many assumed were about women. And yet, those who knew him best saw the cracks in the illusion. Fellow musician Boy George once said, "Many people assumed he was heterosexual. I never did." But George never confirmed nor denied anything. Instead, he let the rumors swirl, dodging questions and keeping his personal life fiercely guarded. That is, until one fateful day in April 1998, when everything came crashing down in the most humiliating way possible. It wasn't a magazine interview or a heartfelt speech. It was an arrest. He was caught by an undercover officer in a public restroom in Beverly Hills, engaging in what authorities deemed a lewd act. The headlines exploded. News outlets around the world plastered his mugshot everywhere. And just like that, the secret was out. But instead of retreating in shame, George did something no one expected. He took control of the narrative. Days later, he appeared in an interview with CNN and, without hesitation, confirmed what had long been speculated. He was gay. Not only that, but he revealed that he had been in a committed relationship for years with Kenny Goss, a former flight attendant. If the world thought he would crumble under the weight of the scandal, they were mistaken. But that's not all. Instead of shying away, George fired back with Outside, a cheeky, disco-infused song that turned the entire situation into satire. The music video was a direct jab at the scandal, featuring policemen dancing in a restroom under a glittering disco ball. It was bold, it was unapologetic, and it was George Michael in his truest form, defiant, brilliant, and completely unbothered by what the world thought. His journey with fame, identity, and personal demons was far from over, and the battles ahead would push him further than he ever imagined. By the early 90s, he wasn't just fighting for his identity. He was about to take on one of the most powerful corporations in the music industry. And this wasn't just about a contract dispute. This was a war for artistic freedom, and George was willing to risk everything to win it. At the height of his fame, George found himself trapped in a deal he had signed as a young, eager artist with CBS Records, which later became part of Sony Music. Back then, he was grateful just to have a record deal. But now, as a seasoned musician with a clear artistic vision, he realized he had signed away too much control. His success was undeniable. Faith had sold over 25 million copies. Listen without prejudice. Voldemort 1 was critically acclaimed, but Sony was still treating him like a product rather than an artist. In 1993, he made a bold move. He sued Sony Music, claiming the label was deliberately sabotaging his career by failing to properly promote Listen Without Prejudice, Vol. 1. He wanted out of his contract, arguing that he was essentially a professional slave with no control over his own work. This wasn't just about him. George wanted to set a precedent for other artists who felt powerless against massive record labels. The music industry watched closely, and fans held their breath, hoping their idol would emerge victorious. But then came the devastating blow. After months of legal battles, the court ruled in Sony's favor, dismissing George's claim. Furious and unwilling to give Sony another album, he went on strike. He refused to release new music under the label, effectively putting his career on hold rather than giving them another hit. For 3 years, one of the biggest artists in the world remained silent, locked in a standoff that tested his patience and resolve. Then came the plot twist. In 1995, he finally found a way out. Virgin and DreamWorks struck a deal that bought out his contract, freeing him from Sony's grip. His triumphant return came with Jesus to a Child, an emotional ballad dedicated to his late lover, Anselmo Filippa. The song soared to #1, proving that even years of legal battles couldn't silence his talent. His career may have been back on track, but his personal life was about to take another heartbreaking turn, one that would change him forever. Just when George Michael seemed to be reclaiming control over his career, life struck him with a pain that no success could shield him from. The early 90s had already been a period of upheaval, but nothing could prepare him for the heartbreak that followed. At the height of his fame, George fell in love with Anselmo Filippa, a Brazilian dress designer who brought him the kind of happiness he had never publicly acknowledged before. Their relationship was filled with joy, but it came with an unbearable twist. Soon after meeting, Anselmo was diagnosed with AIDS. The months that followed were agonizing as George watched helplessly, unable to change the inevitable. When Anselmo passed away in 1993, George was left devastated, forced to grieve in silence since he had not yet come out. Still reeling from the loss, George poured his emotions into his music, writing Jesus to a Child as a deeply personal tribute. It was his way of speaking about Anselmo without revealing too much, crafting a song that was melancholic, heartfelt, and filled with longing. The world embraced it, pushing it to number one, yet few truly understood the depth of sorrow behind the lyrics. Just as he began to emerge from his grief, another tragedy struck. In 1996, his mother, Leslie, lost her battle with cancer. The bond between them had been unbreakable. She had always been his anchor, the person who grounded him through fame and chaos. Losing her so soon after Anselmo felt like the final blow. The weight of these losses sent George into a deep depression. He withdrew from the spotlight, struggling with a sadness that no amount of success could fix. Friends and those close to him noticed the shift. His once vibrant energy was replaced with a quiet, almost unreachable sadness. Though music remained his outlet, the wounds ran deep. The public saw the superstar, but behind closed doors, he was a man unraveling. And soon, that pain would manifest in ways that would make headlines for all the wrong reasons. As George Michael's life unfolded, the struggles he once kept hidden began spilling into the public eye in ways that couldn't be ignored. The man who had once been known for his polished image and undeniable talent was now making headlines for something entirely different: his growing battle with substance abuse. What began as a private coping mechanism for grief and personal struggles soon turned into a very public downfall. The first signs of trouble emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s, when whispers of his drug use started surfacing. He had always been open about smoking marijuana, even joking about it in interviews, but as time went on, it became clear that this was more than just casual indulgence. Reports of him using harder substances, including crack cocaine and GHB, started surfacing. Friends and colleagues grew concerned, but George, who had always been fiercely independent, refused to let anyone intervene. His relationship with drugs became intertwined with his need for escape from fame, from loss, and from the pressures that had weighed on him for decades. Then came the arrests. In 2006, he was found slumped over the wheel of his car at an intersection in London. He was charged with possession of drugs, but the incident was brushed off as an isolated mistake. Then it happened again and again. Each time, the consequences grew more severe. In 2008, he was caught in possession of crack cocaine in a public restroom, and by 2010, the situation had spiraled completely out of control. That year, after attending a gay pride parade, George got behind the wheel and crashed his Range Rover straight into the front of a Snappy Snap store in London. The image of the shattered storefront became symbolic of his own fractured reality. This time, there was no avoiding the fallout. He was sentenced to 8 weeks in prison, banned from driving for 5 years, and forced to confront the fact that his demons were no longer just personal. They were now destroying his life. Even in the face of legal trouble, George never shied away from admitting his struggles. He spoke candidly about his addictions, about how they had taken hold of him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But knowing the problem and fixing it were two different things. His fans watched with concern as he continued to battle his own self-destructive tendencies. The man who had once stood at the pinnacle of pop music was now a cautionary tale. Yet those who truly knew him still believed in his ability to turn things around, and for a while it seemed like he might. But fate had other plans. By the time the 2010s arrived, George Michael had been through wars, both legal and personal. And though he had fought hard to keep his career and life afloat, the years had taken a toll on him. The once unstoppable pop icon, who had spent decades dominating the charts and defying the odds, was now facing an enemy he couldn't outrun: his own declining health. His struggles with addiction and legal troubles had already put him under intense scrutiny. But what happened next would prove that even George Michael wasn't invincible. In 2011, while on his Symphonica tour, tragedy nearly struck. After performing in Vienna, he suddenly fell gravely ill. What initially seemed like exhaustion turned into something far worse: severe pneumonia. He was rushed to a hospital where doctors fought to save his life. It was worse than anyone realized. For weeks, George lay in intensive care, slipping in and out of consciousness. A tracheotomy was performed to keep him breathing, and at one point, his condition became so critical that his loved ones feared the worst. When he finally regained consciousness, he had lost weeks of his life, unable to remember much of what had happened. Emerging from the hospital, frail and visibly weakened, he tearfully thanked the doctors who had saved him, calling it the worst month of my life. Though he survived, something about him had changed. He returned to the stage in 2012 to perform a special concert for the very hospital staff who had saved him. But fans could see that the once unstoppable performer was not the same. His energy was lower, his presence more fragile. He became increasingly reclusive, disappearing from the public eye for long periods. The man who had once thrived on connecting with his audience was now retreating into solitude. Reports of continued drug use, depression, and struggles with his mental and physical health continued to surface, but George rarely addressed them. Despite this, his legacy remained untouchable. His music endured, his influence undeniable. Even in his absence, his songs continued to fill airwaves, soundtracks, and stadiums. Yet those closest to him knew something was wrong. On Christmas morning, 2016, the world awoke to devastating news. George Michael was gone. At just 53 years old, the man who had spent decades filling stadiums, breaking records, and changing lives had taken his final bow. Found lifeless in his bed by his partner, Fadi Fawaz, his passing was as sudden as it was heartbreaking. In the days that followed, speculation ran wild. Could it have been the years of drug use? Was it his long battle with depression? The truth was both simpler and more tragic. His heart had simply given out. The coroner ruled it natural causes, citing dilated cardiomyopathy, myocarditis, and fatty liver. But for millions of fans around the world, it didn't feel natural. It felt like the loss of a legend far too soon. Tributes poured in from every corner of the globe. Elton John, his longtime friend and collaborator, called him one of the kindest, most generous souls in music. Fans gathered outside his London home, lighting candles and playing his songs in the streets. Across radio stations, Careless Whisper, Faith, and Last Christmas played on repeat, turning a season of joy into a time of remembrance. But beyond the music, something else emerged. Stories of George's quiet, relentless generosity. For years, he had secretly donated millions to charities, often without taking credit. He had funded children's hospitals, supported AIDS research, and even helped individuals in need. One woman revealed that he had anonymously paid for her IVF treatment after she appeared on a talk show, discussing her struggles to conceive. A homeless shelter worker shared how George had volunteered regularly, insisting on doing it without publicity. Even after his death, stories of his kindness continued to surface, proving that he was not just a music icon, but a humanitarian in every sense of the word. Though he had spent much of his later years away from the public eye, his influence never faded. His music remains timeless, his impact on pop culture undeniable. Whether it's the rebellious swagger of faith, the soul-stirring honesty of Jesus to a child, or the infectious joy of Wake Me Up Before You Go-Go, George Michael's voice continues to echo through generations. And while his life was filled with ups and downs, triumphs and struggles, one thing is certain: his legacy will never fade. He didn't just leave behind a collection of hits. He left behind a soundtrack to people's lives. And that is something that not even time can take away.